Hello, this is Odoamne, and you're on the YouTube channel of the internet's most notorious ginger man, Thorin.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is RichsWrath, aka, it's very relevant to this interview, H2k Rich, if people know from back in the day. So let's just start there, Rich. Like, first things first, I actually would like to know what your involvement with H2k is, because the weird thing is, this is where it's the time period that this all take place that makes it a bit confusing. Because obviously, yes, there was a team called H2k that played in CS 1.6, my old game a long time ago. But as far as I know, like, that isn't any of the people I know of the modern day H2k. Was in LEC and all that jazz. Well, EU LCS. So what was your involvement with H2k? Were you like a founder of it? I assume it was like a different org, but was it some sort of like H2k Gaming was the one you found? Give me the backstory and how you became involved with H2k.
Yeah, so it's actually a really mental story, but I'll try and do like the sort of the quick version. Yeah, I mean, it was a 1.6 org, basically run by about a bunch of Swedish people. All the players they typically went for were like Scandinavian. I think even Spawn was on H2k at one point, I believe, for sort of a brief stint. That has nothing to do with me. I had no involvement. That was its own thing. But back then, this probably may surprise, newer viewers, but won't surprise anyone who's been around since then. There was like no professionalism or formality or anything to that whatsoever. There was no actual company. These were like a bunch of Swedish kids, sort of late teens, early 20s, who just had this org and got a little bit here, a little bit there from various companies to be able to send people to LAN events in Counter-Strike, basically. I had nothing to do with that. So my involvement came really randomly when I was at university. And believe it or not, back then, you'll know, because I believe you did this for SK, I was a writer, like used to do writing for orgs. And I applied to do some writing, like completely free work. You didn't get paid for that shit back then unless you were on like a big boy org with H2k. And I met with the CEO called Stefan, who just immediately, like, we got on really well and he really liked me. And he's like, oh, you should be doing way more than like just writing. Okay. And basically in the space of a couple of weeks, he just made me like general manager of H2k. And I was like, oh, okay, fair enough. And the goal back then was to just do Counter-Strike, basically. I remember we had that Norwegian lineup, was one of the first ones I was involved in, with like Polly and Rubino, Rain, even if people remember back then, was on the team. And we were going to like various events, Copenhagen Games, obviously just European Benelux events and so on. And then, so how I actually came to be the founder, because right at this moment in time doesn't really sound like I'm the founder. As I said, there was no formal company or registration or anything back then at all. And what was going to happen was like, right, we're going to go bigger in Counter-Strike and we want to get involved in League of Legends and we want to eventually have like an EU LCS team. So we need to make this shit more professional. And I had no interest in being like involved on a grander scale at this moment in time because I was still doing university. I also had a job at the same time. And I was like, okay, if we get to that point where we're like all inning and we have like an LCS team or whatever, I'll revisit it then. But for now, I'm going to let the people who own the brand, I guess, so far as there were owners, deal with that shit. So this Stefan guy goes and gets 2 Norwegian investors who are like rich, wealthy guys, but they're not, the VC level, huge, whatever. And they're going to form the company and they're going to put some money into it to begin with, sort of in the 5 figures kind of range to sort of fund the company and buy shares and distribute them. So they were going to buy like 50% and Stefan was going to have 50%. But the thing was, Stefan had a massive drug problem. So he was dealing with all these kinds of like weird legal things that were going on, massive like personal issues and family issues. And I noticed going from like event to event, like all the money that was meant to be coming in to like helping out the players and sending them in hotels, like everything you can imagine just never happened. And I ended up like fronting all of it because I was always the guy who was there in person at the events to help out. So I just ended up fronting everything and paying for everything myself. And I was like, this is fucking annoying, but it is what it is. And yeah, basically I spoke to the Norwegian investors and they're like, he can't even afford to pay for his own shares. Do you want to? And I was like, I guess, like at the time, as I said,
was it like a reasonable price at the time? It wasn't something crazy, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, nothing crazy.
A few thousand, right?
Like, yeah, exactly. Like I think it's 2,500 or 3,000 euros or something like this. So I was like, yeah, I can pay for that. Like, sure, no problem. So and then because they were based in Norway and they had like full-time gigs doing whatever they were doing. So like, you are now the CEO and you are a co-founder and CEO of H2k. So that's like the long and the short of it. I mean, there was like some really wacky, crazy stuff that went on along the way. But essentially, the guy could not afford his own shares, and he ended up like fleeing the country and is now in like some tax haven somewhere. So yeah, that's how it started, at least.
Classic esports.
And then by the way, around the same time is when we signed the first H2k team, which we lost because of these issues as well. So for people who don't know, the team that became ROCCAT was actually H2k.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, Vander, Jankos, like Fly, who then became the manager. These people were on H2k. They left because of like money and payment issues that he had caused, and then left. And I wasn't aware of any of this stuff. I was just aware that we had a league team or whatever, but because I wasn't particularly involved, I was just doing my shit. So yeah, and then as soon as I came in, as I said, I've been fronting up. The main reason I actually ended up paying is because I was like, I've put so much money into this that I will never get back, that I need to have something for this. I think if I hadn't spent anything or been trying to cover the gaps, I probably wouldn't have bothered. But I had like this sunken costs fallacy in me. You know, I was like, no, I need to get something for the money I've already put in, which is why I ended up doing that. And the first thing we did when I came in was we were like, oh, that Cloud9 team, that Cloud9 Eclipse team, for people who don't remember, there was a European team. Riot just changed the rules so you couldn't have multiple teams in multiple regions. They're the best European team, and they're going to qualify. So Cloud9 is going to be in a position where they're going to lose that team. So I was like, we need to get that team, because that team's fucking sick. And for people who don't remember, that was Odo, Yarnan, Febiven. Like, this was a fucking really shit hot team. Ku, rest in peace. For people who remember Ku, he was a beast back in the day in jungle. And Voidal was the support at the time as well. So I was like, that is the team that's good. Not only is that like the best non-EU LCS team, that team could do something in EU LCS. So that was like my starting point.
By the way, as you said, like the joke is the H2k team you had became ROCCAT and then inexplicably famously beat the Nuke team and qualified to LCS and then was like a relevant team. They were like this far from going to Worlds. Like, did that piss you off that essentially you could have actually had a really awesome start to the scene? Like back then, you had to be the big orgs like SK, Fnatic to have the top teams. This team actually would have been a banger right on the gate.
Yeah, I think I was not nearly as mad as I would have been because I had no idea what was going on. Right. And like I was sold a bunch of lies as well. As I said, even though I was like general manager because this guy likes me or whatever, like I had no idea what was going on with payments or any of this stuff. Right. I just knew that we had this really good team who like I remember finding out like, they went to like DreamHack Bucharest, for example, and they beat that really good Copenhagen Wolves team, which again had Reckless on for people who don't remember, who was loaned out from Fnatic. It Shook in the Jungle, who went on to be like a really good player for a while. There was a really good team and they were favourites to win. And our team actually won. I remember thinking, oh, that's fucking awesome. Cool. We must have a really good League of Legends team. And then they just inexplicably disappeared. But obviously the story I was told was not, we didn't pay them properly. And they were like, it was like, oh, you know, there's a better project out there probably for us, didn't fit right. Some bullshit, right? So yeah, I guess I was never really too mad in retrospect because I think the team I ended up getting was even better. So it's like, yeah, I didn't.
Well, the joke as well is, like you say, in a weird way, the universe like took with one hand and gave with the other because actually they fucked Jack on that one. Like, as you say, his European challenger team was shit hot. It was basically them and Nip at the time, and Nip obviously had the problem with the jungler. And these two were the ones that on paper were like a lock to qualify. But there's the obvious segue point, isn't it, Rich? Because back then you had a player called Febiven in the mid lane, and famously, what everyone said about Febiven, and it did happen at the first qualifier, I noticed you had to go through that last chance one, is everyone used to say he chokes when he gets to land though. I know that sounds mad now because people look at it, wait, he was in like the Fnatic that went 18-0 and he was at Worlds in the semis. Back then, can you give me some thoughts on Febiven and this initial failure?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I would actually even call it choking, but more just incredibly immature, like incredibly immature to the point where if people remember when we played against Copenhagen Wolves in the best of 5 to get into LCS, he picked Ari 3 games in a row where it wasn't even like a particularly super S-tier meta pick, and it certainly wasn't good into what they were doing against us. And it was just pure stubbornness and this attitude that he had where he thought, I can't remember what picks were like being pushed and recommended or whatever, but his line was literally, those are skillless champs. You don't need hands to play those champs. Those are bad player champs. I'm playing Ari. And when he lost on Ari, it was like, now I have to play Ari.
Right.
And then
if people don't know, this is
again,
almost Febiven level in itself. Like, these are the same
yeah.
sorts of shit he would say, I know.
Yeah, no, it was ridiculous. Like, that was, in retrospect, that series was unwinnable. Like, knowing that going, like, if we'd known that going in, it was mental. And we also had in that series AOD, who is now the coach for Astralis, who played support, who had a similar kind of attitude towards support, and he'd always play, like, he had this famous Morgana, like, he usually played Morgana or Thresh, and he had a similar attitude where he was like, these are just the skill champs, like, all that fucking tank engage shit, that's for pussies, like, this is the real shit. So yeah, there was some issues on that team, because if you actually combined, like, the best players, forget about being in LCS, the best players at any given time who were, like, on that team was so good, but they had so many flaws at that moment in their careers. Like, AOD was so flawed, but he was actually better than Voidal, who ended up going into LCS with us. And Trashy, who was better than Lulex, but again, issues.
Later known as Cold, for people who don't know.
Yeah, and then Febiven was the exception, where, like, we felt that Febiven was so good that we wanted to continue with him, but it was kind of out of our hands. I mean, essentially what happened with Febiven...
Didn't he already, like, low-key agree to go to Fnatic, basically, before the qualified? Right?
He'd been completely poached.
Which is interesting you say that, because I also know stories where Fnatic / Sam Matthews poach people, but he's one of the most vociferous opponents of poaching when it's Carlos, apparently. You know.
Yeah, no, he was like straight up. He was straight up poached, and we were basically even told, like, because back then as well, Riot's rule now is if your team is in our database, then the poaching rules apply. If they're not, then they don't. And back then, the only people in the database were LCS. That was it. There was no challenger whatsoever. So even though we were, like, probably in reality, like, the third best team in the whole fucking region, we just technically weren't in the league. We're not on the database. So he was not on the database. Fnatic were just talking to him every day, telling him about, you know, we're Fnatic, we're amazing. Obviously, they were the dominant, preeminent team back then. They won everything. And this was when Peke was about to leave, obviously. So, I mean... I don't feel badly towards him at all. In fact, what happened is I ended up calling his. I had a few conversations with him and his dad, and we basically said, "Look, he's going to go to Fnatic. There's nothing we can do about that. Wish him all the best. But one thing we ask is, can he stick around for this expansion tournament to help us get us in? Because we're in a pickle, basically. If not, like, because they wanted him to go immediately, which I thought was, like, kind of bullshit." Wild, yeah. Because it's like, we have this massive tournament to play, and you just want him for an extra week of scrims or whatever. Like, so we did agree that he would then play that tournament with us. So we knew he was going to leave, but also, you know, it was kind of, everything was fine, you know, because he did what he set out to do with us anyway, and then he went on to what would be bigger and better things, I guess. So yeah, it was fine.
Right, one thing I want to ask is, before we get to the era, because obviously he was a long time H2k player, and then you know him since then. Your boy Odoamne, who, as far as I know, aren't you his agent?
Yeah.
Just thought to mention that as a disclaimer here. Right. Obviously, this is back when he was just some fucking Romanian guy that was just a really good top laner and kind of came out of nowhere on the Cloud9 team, like you say. Was Odoamne, I mean, it's funny because his game is so timeless and consistent and classic. Was he the same sort of person back then? Because if people don't know, I'm not as shocked as maybe some of the fans are that, like, he's not in Rogue or he has this weird thing in Excel. Because if people don't know, I vibe with him because it's my type of person, but he is really fucking upfront and he likes conflict, if people don't know. Like, it's not even that he just talks. He just likes, that's his way of communicating. Like, first of all, just come from East Europe, guys. You have to understand, they're just like that. They're not fucking like, it's not like corporate culture in America. But I just wondered, in the early days, was he considered toxic? Was he a cool guy back then? What was the early Odoamne like?
He was more cocky back then. Like, now he has this kind of dry, almost British, like, cynical sense of humor, I guess, which he's, like, honed over, like, a lot of years. Back then, there was a time when people thought he was, like, a bad teammate. Not in the game, particularly, but, like, in VOD reviews and out of the game, he was very, like, I would say he had a very big ego, and he would, like, talk down on people a lot, which I think he felt in his head was, like, quite comedic sometimes, but it didn't always vibe with people. And I remember, even though this was a massive overreaction, because the manager wanted to kick different people every fucking week, but I remember his name would come up a lot. I was like, we should replace this guy, we can get Duke from Korea or whatever, and I'm always like, you're fucking mental. But where that came from was that he was having conflicts with people outside of the game in that sense, but he evolved massively over time, and now I think basically everyone who plays with him says he's like a great teammate.
Yes.
So yeah, I think he's always been a great teammate in game. He's always had like really good clear comms, and he's always been obviously a top tier player. But I think outside of the game, he was kind of like he was very normal in a lot of ways. In that, I think he was sort of stereotypically like cool, I guess. Whereas like,
I mean, if people don't know, he's one of those players that's never had a problem getting girlfriends and stuff. He's not a super nerd in that regard. Yeah, he's always had like
exactly. I was about to say, like, on that team, for example, like AOD, like Febiven, like all these young guys, I would know they were gamers from a mile away, you know, yes. Like they were very stereotypically gay. Odo was like, came into a room, like smile, shake your hand, like introduce himself, like dictate the conversation. Like he was much more well developed. I could tell that he'd been doing like high level sport and stuff like outside of the game, and had like finished school and been surrounded by sort of more normality, I suppose, and not just locked in a basement. So yeah, he was always like ahead of everyone else and more developed, to the point where when I met him, he was either 18 or 19, but he was like a normal social 18 or 19-year-old. The others were like 13-year-olds mentally, you know? So yeah, he was definitely a lot more cocky back then, I would say, and he like reeled that in massively. Like he's still obviously very self-confident, but he's not as outwardly like, I'm so much better than this, like these trash players or whatever. Like he doesn't do that anymore. He's much more sort of grounded. But yeah, I mean, in terms of play style as well, I think back then he still believes it now, and I believe it as well to a certain extent. But like people try and pigeonhole him as like this tank only player and stuff like this. I think he's just realized in more recent years that he can most easily band-aid other people's problems by playing in that way. Like if he plays something and hyper carries, and by the way, not too long ago when you saw him in summer on Schalke and so on, he was just straight up hard carrying games.
Yes.
But he just feels that on a consistent basis, other people, and again, not in like a condescending way, but other people will make too many mistakes that he can't bandage if he plays the carry and he's constantly on a side lane away from his team. Whereas I think he feels more comfortable and in control when he plays these more, tank sort of weak side, if you like. Like he can just sucker up like all of his team's problems into his own little vase, and then they can play more freely. But back then, especially, he was playing like way more carry stuff. Like him and Febiven used to argue in draft about like who would play. Like back then, Jace was like a super flex, right? It would always either go top or mid, and it was equally good in both, and they would like argue about which one of them got to play it, you know? And it was like a legitimate conversation, like who is better on this champion, our fucking mid laner or our top laner? And they were like sort of top 3 in their role, even when they weren't in the LCS. So yeah, he was a very, very good carry player back then, and I guess just because he doesn't do it as much, he's probably regressed, or let's say less practiced on that.
Well, I have a question about this actually. So the question goes, if you notice, as you said earlier, this is the guy who, if people don't know, is like a player's player, if you know what that terminology means. Like, there's a reason why the players always have him in high esteem, and a lot of his teammates think he was not only very good at the game, but a great teammate. And it's why I notice experts and analysts always have him as like, if I'm ever making a super team, I always put him as top lane, because then, as you pointed out, like spoiler, look at all his teams, the fucking ADC's nearly always like the star of the team. He's just the most perfect fucking weak side player ever. But what people don't know, as you said, is he could definitely play the carries. Like I remember back in season 5, Kelsey, who at the time I already talked to, obviously, and I remember Veteran wrote an article on this, I think. They actually had him as the next best top laner after Hooney, when Hooney was in his peak, because he's one of the only ones that could sort of match up with him. Obviously, later at the Season 6 Worlds, he had all that shit on, like you say, on Jace, so he was just hard carrying, wrecking Koreans in scrims. Like, essentially, if his career went a different way, like we could GM his teams in a different sense, and maybe we make it like the weak side ADC, this guy could have had the same respect from players, but his career could have been so different, right?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, like I will put it's an uncontroversial take, I guess, but like Soaz for me is like the Western GOAT of top lane at the moment. There is like an argument, I guess, you can make for Wonder. I do think now Odo is so hard winning the longevity argument, and I see no reason why he'll drop off like anytime remotely soon. But the only thing he'll probably lack at the end is like team accolades. Like I guess he'll probably still be short on that. But yeah, for me, like the sustained level, like even, by the way, bear in mind the regular season now is 3 fucking weeks. And after week 1, people were like, Odo is washed, which they say at the start of every season. And then in season 2, oh wow, he's fucking mega again, like S tier superstar level. Like who could have fucking guessed? Like I just think there are certain players that it really is purely just a motivational thing. And I don't mean like he didn't have motivation, then he did. I just mean like as long as this guy is motivated to play, he will be either the best or in and around the best players. Same with Jankos, by the way. I put that guy like in the same bracket for jungle. Like these guys can be as S tier for as long as they fucking want. So yeah, I think that he has always been sort of unfairly judged because of the, I guess, falling short, and at one point in time, like the choking narrative, which a brush Jankos was also painted with. But again, I think in recent times you can see that's not been the case. Like he reached a bunch of finals, they were super unlucky not to win them. He wasn't really the problem in any of those finals, and then when they finally won the final at the third time of asking, obviously he was unbelievable, and also in the semi-final against Fnatic, right? So I think that yeah, he's kind of overcome all the stuff that was held against him, and now it's sort of, yeah, everything he does from this point is just building, in my opinion. And I would guess, as I say, when he does eventually retire, he'll probably will go down as the GOAT of top lane, just because he'll have so many splits where you like he was top 3, and I don't think that you'll be able to say that for any of the other guys he's competing with.
Right, one thing that is a kind of peculiarity is, aside from the famous Huni and Reignover pickup, your team was also one of the first ones to import a Korean, because you obviously brought over the very famous at the time Ryu, the guy who, the other Z, as they always called him, right? If people don't know, he had initially come to Europe, and I know he was in like, he stood in for like Millennium or something, or like ROCCAT. He was in a couple of teams, and he was around the scene, and people knew like he's available or whatever. And obviously at the time, like he'd only had, I think it was only like one split, wasn't that great in Korea, but as usual, if you know how things are in Korea, you're either the best or you're nothing, basically. Like when they kick you out, you're out. So what was the story behind getting this guy? Because at the time that was a big risk, and obviously this team was good actually with him.
Yeah, so it was actually a very simple, easy choice based on a very simple logic, which was we played a bunch of scrims against him, and he was doing the best against Febiven of any mid. Right. The only other mid that was like comparable was Froggen. And obviously he wasn't available, so it was just he was by far the best. And we also knew that he had shot calling tendencies. We were told he was like very shy, and you had to sort of bring it out of him. He wouldn't just volunteer it necessarily, at least in scrims on stage he would tend to do it. So we just thought it was kind of the only person that could replace Febiven at the time, because again, we weren't in the position monetarily or anything else where we can go out and get some absolute top of their game player in the region or whatever. This guy had been playing on a challenger team, so he was available, and yeah, he just matched up the best. And by the way, Febiven was a complete mute. Like a lot of mid laners have this issue, but they just treat mid as an island, and it's all about my lane and my ego against the other mid laner, especially back then for him. And Ryu was kind of the opposite. He was very much the team-centric mid laner who gave a lot of comms and didn't suffer too much in laning. As I said, he did the best of any mid other than Froggen against Febi in our scrim. So yeah, it was actually a really easy choice. He was by far the best player that was available at the time.
As you say, one of the problems, though, is like, because obviously if people don't know, his KT Bullets team, it doesn't surprise me if people don't know that, like, he had a continued career in a different region speaking a second language. And if people don't know, Score and Maffa were literally coaches of, like, top teams, and Score became, like, the greatest jungler ever. Like, as far as I know, that team must have had a really amazing combo of, like, shot calling things. They used to have amazing map rotation. But I heard the same thing, which is, like, he's the main shot caller of the team. And so I wondered when he came over, though, being Korean, like, people know he was on, like, Twitter and stuff. He can be very terse with how much he talks. How did he actually operate as like someone having to speak in English shot calling though?
Yeah, so I think especially at the start, struggled in scrims a lot, getting him to talk and to adopt that role. I think he sort of just did it out of frustration after a while. He's like, the other play, like, I want to be quiet and I want to not say much. I'm not too comfortable with my English, but no one is doing the role that needs to be done properly. And he would reach a point around scrim 3 or something where enough is enough, and he just starts micromanaging the whole game. But I do also think that Prolly had a lot to do with that. Prolly was like very good with making Koreans feel comfortable and appreciated as well, and he would like bring it out of Ryu and tell him like trust yourself, you're really good at this, like your English is actually really good, like your in-game English is fine, like you can do it. Like very sort of stereotypical sort of fist bumpy motivational style when it came to this stuff, but it worked pretty well with Ryu, I think, and Ryu actually respected Prolly as well. So I think it could have been disastrous if you'd had, especially like back then, so many coaches were complete frauds, like actual complete frauds that no one respected. And I think if you'd taken basically any other coach in the league and put him there, Ryu would just have not been remotely interested. I mean, you remember all those little stories and tidbits about things Ryu used to say. That is Ryu's personality. And if you've got a coach he doesn't respect, he's going to treat you like you're a fucking dog, especially if you're younger than him, because obviously they had this dynamic as well. Prolly was actually one of the older people in the scene at the time. So it was like a perfect match of like coach and mid laner to like bring that out of Ryu.
Right, obviously, another player, maybe it's not as obvious to other people, but I remember back then, the players I was most interested in this team was Ryu for obvious reasons, Odoamne, because it's like, who's this guy? He actually is legit when he gets to it. But the other one, the joke is, he's going to be the least famous, except for Lulex, obviously. It's kaSing. And the reason why I bring up kaSing is, one, he was a UK player, so I was obviously slightly interested in that sense. But secondly, he was actually really good. If people don't remember, like, this guy actually had a lot of talent. But the thing that was weird about him was, I remember the few times I talked to him, I didn't want to show once. He seemed to have a very strange personality, though, mate. Like, the joke is, it almost seemed like he didn't know how good he was or believe in himself. Because I know I tried to do that jokey thing where I sort of like flame people a little bit to make them open up. And I think it actually hurt his feelings, believe it or not. It was just like on a show or something. So who was kaSing? Because the sad thing is, he hung around for a lot of years after. He might even have been still playing, I think, for the last few years, like NLC or something ridiculous. But he never peaked like he should have. I know he once had the TSM off for himself at one point. Like, who was kaSing?
Yeah, his personality is kind of weird in the sense he was like simultaneously cocky and humble, I guess. Okay. Whereas like if you listen to him playing solo queue, you'd think this guy was like an arrogant little fuck, you know. But when you actually like put him on the spot and talk about the game, he would like speak very well and be sort of very complimentary of people, and not just necessarily like in a PR way, like the cameras on him or something. But he was quite. Again, he was like one of the more normal people for sure, I would say, like from a player perspective, he was like quite well-rounded and balanced. But yeah, I think he was also quite sensitive in a sense. But the thing with kaSing is he was really good for a fairly short period of time, I would say. And I think there's like a few reasons why. First of all, he came in for Voidal, who at the time was just performing horrendously. Like that miracle run when we were like 0-7 or whatever, and then when like 10-7 or something as soon as kaSing came in, that wasn't just because kaSing was like really good. It was also because Voidal was horrendous. So you're like getting addition by subtraction of just getting that guy out of the team. And then kaSing also was playing really well. So it was like a huge buff. The one thing I would say was like a narrative that got pushed like fuck, but that wasn't particularly true, was that kaSing was like this shot caller. Like, right. And this came out as well because H2k were really good at like the lane swap meta, which required loads of comms. Like everyone had a very specific role, and you had to do things in a specific order. And we basically like probably used to plan out like the first 15 minutes of like every game. We're like, this is exactly what's going to happen with this draft. We're going to do this. You're going to go top at this point. You're going to switch. But because we added kaSing into the team, the lazy narrative was like, oh, he must be shot calling, and it's the kaSing effect, and blah, blah, blah. No, the kaSing effect was literally just, he is a way better support than Voidal. I'm not saying, by the way, that his comms were bad or anything like that. They were fine. Like, they were definitely decent. But actually, the shot caller in the bot lane was Yarnan. Yarnan had like the best understanding of lane swap meta of like any player ever. This guy would always just randomly at like minute 5 be hitting mid turret. And you're like, what's going on? Like, why isn't he laning? Like, I don't understand. And it's just because he just intrinsically understood like how tempo, because again, that's when tempo became like a big sort of buzzword as well. And no one understood it better than him. This guy was the king of rotations. And this is also why, and people used to say like, oh, Yarnan, he always plays Sivir. He literally played Sivir so he could move between lanes faster, because he just understood the tempo of lane swap meta better than anyone. So this whole idea that like kaSing was this god tier shot caller, I don't even know where that came from. I assume it was just like a Riot caster narrative or something, because it wasn't true at all. Like, again, I don't want to go the other way, but it was like Yarnan was the real shot caller in that team.
I mean, I was going to touch on it mainly later because obviously it's more spicy with the whole Febiven topic. But let's bring up the Prolly angle then. So as you say, this is a guy where people wonder why I always used to have him on my shows and interview him. This is what the people, when I talk to publicly and privately, you can just see like 5 minutes in, like, oh, this guy isn't full of shit. Like, as you say, back then, so many coaches were managers, like old school Counter-Strike style shit, where they just get the water and they pat the player on the back. But even worse, there was all the fraud ones where they were just a fucking analyst looking at a VOD or looking up what Korean solo queue HQ players, and then just like pretending to be a coach. I won't mention names because players have flamed some of them, but there was some top teams had like fake ass coaches that just weren't legit. So to me, this was one of the first ones who was actually real, because not only was he a former pro, but he actually seemed, bearing in mind he was American, to have a really good sort of way of working with Europeans. Maybe it's because for an American he was considered a bit spicy himself, but he actually seemed like he did a great job in this first year before you got the Febiven and Jankos and all the big names. Like this team, like you're saying, like this was the lane swap era when Europe invented that, and your team was good at that. This was when Origin and Fnatic would tear up the league. Your team was the only team that could contend with them, and your team actually had pretty good macro, if people remember at the time. So what would you say Prolly brought to the team?
I mean, Prolly was basically anyone you asked at the time would tell you the same thing. Because sometimes players can't identify like the reasons why a coach is good or whatever, so you have to ask like a specific question to like get the answer out of them. But essentially, it came down to he was like the only coach who could tell players things about the game they didn't already know. And the thing is that's really important from a respect standpoint, because the problem is if you have this random NPC who's acting as your head coach, and you feel as a 17, 18, 19-year-old that they don't know as much about the game as you do, that's it. It's over.
Yeah,
like they don't have respect for you. They don't care. Everyone respected Prolly. Even like Febiven goes out of his way to be like to say that he respected Prolly, and obviously he says it from the angle of I don't respect anyone, but I respect that guy, kind of thing, you know. So it's like he was telling players things they didn't already know, and I think Lane Swap was like particularly good for that because it was such a unique new thing. And it's like you have players that are like, I genuinely I don't know what to do. What do we do here? And he's like, you do this and you do this, and they're like, then so he's giving them like eureka moments fairly regularly, which always like kept the respect there. And obviously he gets a lot of that from, he was a former player for people who don't know, but also he was just like a smart guy in general. And in terms of like communicating with them, he was like very humor focused, I guess, which obviously vibes well with like toxic little EUS kids, right? Like they like the whole edgy sort of whatever. So he had like a good balance there of being, just very relatable, I think, to the players, but also just very knowledgeable about the game.
You got, when you went to this first Worlds, one of the group draws, which I tried to argue, and basically until recently, when they got away, did away with groups, that like Riot's whole thing of like how they do the pools, where they treat all the pools like they're identical, each team in them, and then they treat region like you can't have the same region. What they never understood was this: Western fans secretly like that because they think it means I can get lucky and get a group. But you can get a group like this. You got essentially the worst group you can get. So as usual, it's one way only 2 teams can get out. So you get SKT, number 1 seed from Korea. By the way, the team many people consider the greatest to ever play League of Legends. Oh, and your number 2 seed, that's just EDG out of fucking China, who've already been a champion and just come second in like their league. Like, give me a fucking break. Like, the problem with this is like, it didn't matter how your team played. There was no way you were going to get out this group, right?
I mean, yeah, it was kind of dead on arrival.
Everyone had to have known it as well, right?
Yeah, there's not much to like even say about this. The funny thing is that during that year, that's when the BBC decided to do this whole documentary thing on like H2k Path to Worlds or whatever, and it was like all building up. Like the final scene, which is really anticlimactic anyway, is actually OG playing against Fnatic and if Fnatic win, we go to Worlds. And if OG win, we don't. And it goes to game 5. So the drama of that is 2 other teams fighting on our behalf, basically. And will we go to Worlds or not? But obviously what they, failed to mention, or it doesn't go the documentary doesn't go far enough to conclude, is it was all kind of irrelevant anyway, because we were just winning the chance to participate in a massacre, essentially. Because, like, what can you do? It's just completely doomed. I mean, our jungler was fucking Lulex, mate. Like, you're going into a tournament against...
If people don't know, they even knew it in the team. There's a reason I made him into a meme on Summoning Insights, because I'd have to just be really horrible about his play, so I just made it like funny, mate. Like he was just a meme to me.
But the only really cool thing was that obviously Ryu versus Faker.
Sure.
Like, it doesn't matter what the strength of the team. That's just cool to see.
Yeah, of course.
On a Western team. So yeah, I don't really have any fond memories, particularly from that World Championship. Like, at least we beat the shit team that got put in our group twice. So yeah, I don't know. It was just also, I would say, for the people who stayed on the team and also for the people who went to other teams, it is kind of good that you go into your rookie season, by the way, this is all of their rookie season, apart from Ryu, of course, straight to Worlds, and then you have that experience, because then hopefully when you actually have a semi-decent chance of doing something, you've got that initial, oh my God, it's my first time ever on the big boy stage out the way. So it probably was good for people like Odo and stuff, who obviously went on to do bigger and better things. So yeah, I guess it was good for them.
Right, now is obviously one of the moments. That's actually why I wanted to do this interview, which is I hate, it's just a personal pet peeve of mine. I hate not only when people mistell the history of esports, but when they're not only like factually wrong, they just get like the villain as the hero and the hero as the villain. I hate shit like that. It actually does really drive me mad, even when it's not to do with me. And so look, I obviously have an obvious bias in this particular case because this story is about TSM. So now comes the off-season with the infamous meme that has haunted you for now almost fucking 10 years, even though, again, as I just alluded to, if people were to just actually take emotion out of it, put the facts in a chronological order, I cannot see how you're the bad guy, Reginald's the good guy, and you were owned somehow. As far as I can tell, you laid out for me, but the basic facts are you wanted to sign Svenskeren in the off-season. Obviously, SK had got relegated. At this time, he was considered the best European jungler, if people don't know. Like, you can argue the Reynolds thing, but Svenskeren was a stud back then, if people don't know. And on top of that, like, I even know, he even admits, like, later in his career, like, he didn't make much money. This was one of those ones where, like, this is one of the reasons I hate the Riot off-season, where back then, it would just be, like, musical chairs, like, and go. The music started, and people, if they were young, would just get so scared, they would just sign the first day with people. Or if you're one you thought you wanted to sign with didn't, you just go with someone else. And so, because no one wanted to be the one in the musical chairs left with no chair. That's the worst scenario ever. So as far as I know, you contacted him, and early on, you had basically a verbal agreement over Skype or something, including, like, 5.5k. So if people don't know, the meme, you cretins, is that's enormous for the EU LCS. Yeah. That's like fucking more than people in Fnatic get paid. Like, that's mental money. So that wasn't like some meme like people think now, like, oh, all these offerings. That essentially you said to him, I'll break the bank for you, motherfucker. Like, I'm not TSM, but I can give you this. And basically, wasn't it something like, there's two details need to be added. One, he did give you a verbal agreement. You had it in the log that he would join. Now, people don't know this, especially considering this is all about a league in Germany. I was told this years ago. In Germany, you can have like emails that are counted as a contract if essentially someone tells you verbally you got the job. In fact, I believe they even go so far with labour laws there. If someone works in your company and never signed a contract, but you pay them as if they were an employee, they can later say, like, well, look, effectively, their actions show I was their employee. Like, people don't get it. They might have found out from the recent Excel stuff, there's a lot more sort of like protections for workers there, basically. So as far as I know, he essentially had committed to you, and you could actually have taken him to court, like you said. Then Reginald obviously swooped in. Look, we all get why people would go and join TSM and the money and all that shit. But the part that was so whack to me was Svenskeren, look, he wouldn't even admit himself he was immature back then. But he did a really stupid thing, in my opinion, which was he tried to paint it that because he wouldn't join, that you actually harassed his mother. Now, here's the detail he didn't add. Wasn't his mother acting as his agent/lawyer in the negotiation? So he made it sound like you were just messaging it, like, give me your version of this. Because like I say, I've already sort of teased it up there that like a lot of it wasn't how it was presented. And the meme part, unfortunately, just haunted you. So give me your take on this story.
Yeah, what's wild is you actually did a video at the time where obviously you don't have any insider info as far as I know at the time. You're just literally using the things that are publicly available, and you basically got it like all correct then. And it, like, to me, I never the reason why it painted a bad narrative was for me was purely because Reggie went on Reddit and basically lied. That's it. Like that's all that side. What actually happened is I go to Svenskeren very early in the off-season. We had, this is when the new American investment group had come in and bought out those two Norwegian guys I was talking about earlier. So they're now in, the budget's gone up a bit. I said to them, I think we should just pay, like, because as you say, this whole musical chair thing, I was like, I think we should pay them all the same amount, which by the way was 2,500, which was like fuck all. But back then was like decent. They were all on 1,500 the year before. I'm like, we should pay them all the same to just like avoid any conflict. Let's get our business done early. The only thing we want to change is jungle. So we wanted to keep Jan and kaSing, Odo and Ryu, and just upgrade jungle to Svenskeren, because with Lulex, we were good enough to go to Worlds. With Svenskeren, I mean, we should be competing to win the split, right? So that was the logic. I go to Svenskeren early. I say, do you want to join H2k? Here's the offer, 2,500. The first thing he says to me is that he doesn't believe me that I have this much money. And I'm like, what? Because on SK, he was getting paid 500 a month.
There you go.
And actually, sometimes not even that, because they were dodgy with payments and stuff, you know. So he couldn't even fathom 2,500 a month. So I was like, okay, well, that makes things easier, right? Like, as soon as I show him proof of payment, then he's on board, it seems like, because obviously he likes the team or whatever. He then said that he would join verbally, and then TSM came in at this point. So and they make him an offer, which obviously, you know, they're entitled to do, even though he has a verbal agreement. They don't know that, whatever. They come in, I have no issue with it. And then he's like, he basically reneges slightly, and he's like, oh, well, maybe TSM. But to be honest, the whole time he's saying he wants to join H2K, and that he's kind of implying that he's annoyed by TSM pestering him. That is basically the implication he's giving. So I'm like, I don't fully believe that. I'm not naive. I'm like, he is probably telling them the exact same thing about us to them, and, you know, whatever. Like, I don't care. But I was like, okay, let's just close this thing fast. I'll offer you 5.5K and a $50,000 signing bonus as well, by the way.
Yeah, that wasn't a thing back then.
So that is, and for those who were like, yeah, meme that as, like, that was an astronomical amount of money for a contract for a player back then for EU. So that was just me trying to speed up the process, get it done and dusted and out the way and move on. And then Reggie came to me with this really stupid proposal of, look, we've got an IEM, I think it was an IEM tournament or something. And they're like, how about we trial Svenskeren for TSM, and if we don't want him, you can sign him like after this. I'm like, let me get this straight. If he goes and plays badly for you, you might let us have him. And I was like, oh, right. And he's like, yeah, so let's agree not to talk any more about this until like the event's over, and then we'll deal with it then. And I'm like, you do you, mate. So he hangs up thinking I've agreed to this like no contact thing with speaking to Svenskeren. Obviously, the first thing I do is speak to Svenskeren. I think that's actually when I added on the thing. I think I'd already offered 5.5K and like, and a 50K bonus, but you have to sign right now. So then he then agrees again. He's like, okay. So at this point, I send over the paperwork immediately. And he starts signing it, like actually signing it. It's one of those contracts where you have to initial at the bottom of each page.
Right.
So he has actually signed parts of the contract at this point. In fact, the only part I can't be 100% sure he signed, although I'm pretty sure he did, was the bottom bit where it says sign here to confirm. And I'm very sure that he actually did, but because I can't physically see it, obviously he can just retcon it later and say that he never actually signed that bit. But I'm talking him through how to sign the contract at this point. And then later that day or the day after, some minion has told Reggie, Reggie, you to go and check to see that, you know, what you agreed is actually upheld. And he's like, oh my God, this guy lied to me. I can't believe he talked to Sven after I came up with this brilliant idea for us both to not talk to him. And then he starts trying to talk to Sven again and then offers him more money, and it gets rid of the trial idea. And he's like, here's a full offer, blah, 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 here's more money. So then Sven basically reneges on everything and signs with TSM. So, and this idea that like, I got outplayed by TSM and I threatened it. Like, it's, if anything, I outplayed him. I'm not going to say it was some insane 4D chess move, but this guy made a really stupid mistake, which I took advantage of. But, you know, money talks and TSM talks, and it is what it is. As for his mum, yeah, she was there the whole time, like, very friendly. Like, all our exchanges were super friendly. I probably shouldn't have done this, but I even leaked some of the emails exchanges between us, because I was like, fuck this, like, my name's getting dragged through the mud. And they were all just super sweet messages being like, I'm really worried about Sven's weight. Like, can you give me assurances that you guys are going to, you know, help him with his diet and stuff like it was all absolute tame, like, yeah, nothing. And the only thing which could be perceived remotely as negative in terms of an exchange that happened between me and anyone on Svenskeren's family side. Again, by the way, it was always family. It was one person. It was his mum who was acting as agent, his lawyer. I never spoke to anyone else. And it was me on a Skype call with her saying like, well, your son did kind of agree to join us, and now I'm hearing that he's going to join TSM. So, yeah, I'm not really happy about this. Like, do you think we could have like a longer form chat about this situation or something like that? And that was it. That was literally it. And the whole thing of like, oh, you threatened legal action against him. No, motherfucker. Go back and actually read, because this Reggie leaks the chat logs, right? It's all there in black and white. We threatened, and by the way, we did exactly what we said we would do. We went after TSM legally for tampering. Sven's not guilty of tampering. He might be guilty of other stuff, but that's neither here nor there. We didn't address it. We wrote a legal letter, which Richard Lewis published, which is addressed to TSM about legal tampering. And my chat log supports that completely 100%. And if you interpreted it any other way, you either did so dishonestly or you can't read. Like, it was a legal threat against TSM, which we actually enacted on that threat. So there's no, like, and this, by the way, this is something that I've noticed so many times. Whenever someone says, like, haha, 5.5k, or does anyone believe this guy after the TSM shit? It's always phrased in the most vague, like, nonsensical way possible. And whenever anyone asks someone to elaborate, they can't. They either say, Google it, or they say, you know, that thing with Sven. Because they don't actually understand. They just heard, like, Reggie go on Reddit once and say, Rich bad. That's it. Like, that's literally it. So, yeah, my crime, as far as I'm aware, is offering a guy a really good contract. I don't know. It's just bizarre.
By the way, along these lines, an obvious like corollary question I should ask, because we hinted at it there, is one of the silliest things about this era is the money's already getting quite legit. As you can see, people are making like a good salary in like our country, the UK, for example, even as like a working adult. And there are contracts, but the joke is no one ever goes to fucking court. So actually, like, first of all, European tampering is slightly different from like American sports. If people don't know, like Riot obviously always operated on like the NFL thing of like, you spoke to them, so we're going to fine you. But even then, the joke about poaching, I always used to say, it's why when CLG got fined like 4 times, like there was like CLG got fined, then like Doublelift got fined, then like got scarred, and it's like, bro, you guys are just dumb fucks. Like everyone's doing this, but you just keep getting caught. Like how are you guys just doing a text log every time? Like, do you not know you do the Skype call, like whatever? But basically, as you said about Fnatic, like, everyone was poaching back then. It was just the default way because you also knew, like, look, as long as Riot doesn't catch us, they can charge us. Like, no one's really going to take us to court, especially because we all want to play a split in like 3 weeks. We don't want to be in court for 2 years, like, and this is why I should. And again, at the end of it, what do you get? They pay your expenses. What do you say on this topic? Because I don't think people know. It looks like it had the veneer that it was professional, but like I say, a lot of it was almost a LARP, right?
Yeah, I mean, just the last thing on the previous thing, by the way, all the people who say like, why so stupid? Why you put all that stuff in writing? Because he literally stopped picking up the phone. What do you want me to do? Like, oh, you win, I guess. You've turned your phone off. You win, I guess. Like, no, I also want things in writing. That's what people don't understand. Like, if I put I mean, this is what I tell players all the time. Obviously, as an agent, I was like, don't put anything in writing that you don't want, that you aren't comfortable with becoming public, essentially, because even now people can't be trusted. But yeah, in terms of like the whole professionalism, like veneer that, I mean, even now I would argue that a lot of things are still super unprofessional. But I mean, back then, like, orgs were paying teams like players cash in hand. Fnatic, for example, they used to play a lot of their players cash in hand. Sometimes what you'd do is you'd have like a base contract, which was illegal, by the way. It would be an independent contractor contract, even though it violated laws. I did a video on that ages ago. Yep. Essentially, the long and short of that is if you spend more than 180 days in Germany working for a company, you are a full-time employee in the eyes of German law, and therefore you have to be treated as such and have a proper contract. They didn't. They had IC contracts, and the IC contracts would say something like, we pay you 800 a month, but then they were giving them like 2k cash in hand. If people don't know the implication, yes, you just don't put. It's up to you to whether you pay the tax, but also maybe they don't even mark it down. You know, they have a million ways of getting around it, right? Yeah. So like loads of teams were doing this. There was also back then, obviously, the Riot stipend was directly going to players, which was like 25k a split or something like that.
I think it was a year. I think it was 25 a year.
Oh, 25 a year. So some teams, in fact, in the first split we joined the league, most teams did not pay their players anything other than the Riot stipend. It was just us, Gambit, and Fnatic, I believe.
I believe that's why most people actually wanted to be in LCS as orgs and players, because as a player, you got way more salary. And as an org, like the joke is like Riot foots the bill for you to be in the league. That's why I always told people, it's not because people like best of ones and round robins. It's just that essentially Riot just sort of said, like, we're Daddy Warbox and we'll just fund the first few years. Like, I can see why everyone did it. Yeah. Yeah. So, as I said, I think it was us, Gambit, Fnatic, and Elements, like previously Alliance, were the only teams that got money on top of the stipend. So yeah, it was and again, like, you'll see loads of horror stories and stuff about, I mean, it used to be a big thing, like the big viewer getter was like Travis Gafford house tours and stuff like this, right? Yes. And like as bad as some of those houses were, right, the European ones were even worse. We are talking like dirty mattress on the floor in like Copenhagen Wolves house and stuff like that, like really fucking bad. And obviously what's really frustrating is, I think, considering how little time we had to like put everything together, I felt always had like a fairly high standard when it came to this stuff. But again, it's just like players will complain about anything. And by the way, I'm not saying that doesn't mean that none of them are justified, but you're just always in a situation where you're trying to like micromanage the
corners that you had to cut, in essence, because it really wasn't professional at all. It was basically a shit show. All the shiny stuff that you saw put together in an end product in a Riot promo video or whatever is just that. That is the literal veneer, if you like. And if you actually did a properly filmed, like behind the scenes TSM style, Legend style documentary or whatever, and you went into some of these fucking Gambit as well, that was another bad one. Like, yeah, it was not luxurious living at all that it proclaimed to be at the start.
I've been pleasantly surprised during the time I've had my Patreon and my Patreon community, the Skrilluminati, by both the financial support they've provided and the moral support. And so this video was kindly supported and made possible by Starlust, Theo Buenzelli, Ahmed Haju, Matt Pugnaccio Racula, Toucan, Jensen Go, Animosity, Tobias Bernasconi, Bot Pounder 420, Yurka 86, Tosh, and as always, you know it, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to ask a question in one of those AMAs where I tend to go pretty in depth? Sometimes they even spin out into their own videos. Do you want teasers to find out who the upcoming guests are for the myriad of interviews that I do across esports? Maybe you want to suggest a topic or a guest. We have a channel on my Discord where you can do that if you're at the right tier. And of course, you could potentially take part in one of those lengthy esports discussions with me about whatever is on your mind in the scene. Well, if any of those perks sound tantalizing, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.